I know that my films, when they screen in a theater, I know when they're working is when the theater gets very quiet and it almost feels like people are afraid to accidentally drop something on the floor. And that's when I know that the film has done something.
From the heart of The Ohio State University on the Oval, this is Voices of Excellence from the College of Arts and Sciences with your host, David Staley. Voices focuses on the innovative work of arts and sciences faculty and staff. With departments as wide-ranging as art, astronomy, chemistry and biochemistry, physics, emergent materials, and mathematics and languages, among many others, the college always has something exciting happening. Join us to find out what's new now.
Joining me today in the ASC Marketing and Communication Studio is Kym McDaniel, Assistant Professor in the Department of Dance, the Ohio State University College of the Arts and Sciences. She is an experimental filmmaker, writer, photographer, interdisciplinary artist, videographer, editor, choreographer, curator, and educator. Have I left anything out? Professor McDaniel, welcome to Voices.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, I usually wait to ask this question later on in the interview, but I am particularly interested to know how you ended up as a filmmaker. I mean, of all the things in the world you could be doing, how did you end up as a filmmaker, especially one in the Department of Dance?
So the story is a little not linear because I hated movies growing up. I was a very active child. I was a dancer. I did cheerleading. I did swimming. I did running. I think I associated the movie theater with just sitting in the dark and not, having to focus for a long time and not being able to move. So I never had an affinity for filmmaking. I never wanted to do it at all. And it wasn't until I was in undergrad for dance, and then I had a head injury in my early 20s. And because of that injury, I wasn't able to dance or choreograph, but I still had a year left of undergrad, and I was getting my BFA in contemporary performance and choreography. I had taken it was a movement and film class that was co-taught between the film department and the dance department, and I really enjoyed that class, and I felt as though the film professor in that class really was inspiring to me, and I felt very kind of close to her, and gratefully my department at the time worked out this solution where in order to fulfill the remaining dance credits of the degree, I could be taking film classes as long as I was making dance films. So due to the grace and the compassion of the faculty there, it allowed me to complete my degree while being disabled, and then it kind of opened the door for me into filmmaking.
Was the injury caused while you were dancing?
It was, yeah.
Can you say a little more about that?
Yeah, I think as an early 20-year-old, I often talk about the injury as the last physical injury in a string of physical injuries that actually started when I was a child. So I had chronic pain as a child, and then when I really started training professionally for dance, the injuries became more acute. So, I blew out my knee. I had Achilles tendonitis. I broke my foot. I had back issues. It was kind of ongoing kind of physical problems. And now I know, too, is because I have a connective tissue disorder that makes me prone to getting injured. But at the time, I just was kind of consistently being injured. And so I kind of see the head injury kind of the last kind of injury in a string of injuries where it had been coming for a while. And because I think of illness and pain and holistically in the body, I talk about the head injury as though it's an isolated event, but I think spiritually and psychologically, there were things that led me to that moment where I collapsed and, had some really intense symptoms for years that stemmed from this injury.
And my understanding is you also, and I didn't say this as part of your introduction, you've also developed an interest in what's known as disability studies as a result.
Definitely, yeah.
Could you give us a definition? What do we mean by disability studies?
Oh, it's a field that's relatively new. It started in the 90s, more formalized, I guess, in the 90s, but really like the disability rights movement, disability justice started throughout the 70s into the 80s trying to get the ADA passed. So
the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Right, yeah. And so as a academic field, I say it's new, because there hasn't been a lot of departments that, have it as a degree still even. But I think COVID radicalized a lot of people or maybe woke them up more. And it definitely did that for me because all of a sudden everybody was inside and everybody was saying, there was more of a focus on people who are immunocompromised and people who were worried about getting sick or people who were getting long COVID. And I started realizing, I've been having these concerns for, years, and now everybody else is kind of mirroring things that I've experienced for years. And I think that was kind of the push in 2020 for me to go on and get this advanced certificate in disability studies from the City University of New York because I really wanted theory to support my embodied experience. And that's what the certificate did for me.
Is your filmmaking your contribution to disability studies, or have you made other contributions?
I would say yes to the filmmaking, although now, in my mind, there's disability studies, and which is kind of a historical framework for how disability has been implemented and understood in society and culturally. And there's also another kind of field called crip theory, and I feel like my work falls more into this crip theory.
Tell us more about what crip theory is and how is this distinct from, say, disability studies?
Yeah, I would say it's more intersectional than disability studies is. Disability studies, and I think they're continuing to try to make strides in the field, but has traditionally been very white, and has very focused more so on kind of the physical disabilities. And so a big thing in disability studies is thinking about the social model of disability versus the medical model. The medical model believes that if you're sick, it's your fault. If you're disabled, and you use a wheelchair and you can't get into the building, well, you should figure out a way to get into the building somehow anyways. And the social model of disability believes that, no, every building should have ramps, that it's not the person with the disability who's the problem. It's actually society and culture is the thing that needs to shift. And that is 100% true. But for me, as somebody who has struggled with chronic pain and chronic illness and some mental health difference, having a ramp into the building doesn't really do anything for me if I'm struggling with depression, So I think crip theory is more all-encompassing of all the different types of disabilities that move beyond the physical and is kind of interested in complicating disability studies as a field and kind of all of the problems and issues that brings up. And I think, too, there's this relationship with queer theory in crip studies because like queer theory where the field reclaimed the word queer, it's similar with crip theory where they're using a word that was typically derogatory towards people with disabilities and then reclaiming that and saying that it's crip theory as a field of study.
Let's talk about some of your films. Maybe your most recent one, Document with No End. Tell us about this film, and I understand this is an audio medium, and so I'm going to ask you to describe a very visual piece of work.
Well, yeah, I used to teach a class called Sound and Image, so I actually feel like, that film is, it's 50% visual, 50% audio. But yeah, this was a film that so in 2019, I had gotten a job teaching at Binghamton University out in central New York, and then I was teaching in a cinema department there. And then in 2022, I was offered a position teaching screen dance at the University of Utah, which is in Salt Lake City. And that position, I was teaching filmmaking in a dance department, which is similar to what I'm doing here. So I moved out to Salt Lake in 2022, and that's where this film kind of began because I signed the contract to move to Salt Lake, and then 4 days later, the article in the New York Times comes out that says, Salt Lake City is on the verge of an environmental nuclear bomb. And
around water.
Around water, the Great Salt Lake drying up, which is about 45 minutes from Salt Lake City itself. And, I remember calling my mentor at the time and her asking me, can you take back your contract? And I was like, I signed it. I was like, I don't think so. So I moved out there knowing that there was an environmental crisis going on. But I think, again, it's something where I think what I experienced when I moved out there is that this has been going on for decades out there, and a lot of people have become desensitized to it. They're like, oh, yeah, they've been talking about that for years, that the lake is drying up. And as somebody new to the city, I was like, yeah, but there's arsenic in the air. Like, there's science that is showing that this lake is drying up at a rapid pace and that there's poison being released into the air, and there's no way that the wind isn't carrying that to the city. And so it was on my mind. As soon as I moved out there, I started realizing I had this growing paranoia of going outside, even like opening my windows, and because Salt Lake is in a valley, the air quality there beyond the Salt Lake drying up can get really bad because the air gets trapped in the valley and on and on. And so I was having this anxiety about the air and kind of making this connection to the invisibility of poison and the invisibility of illness. And then I got really sick. My thyroid tweaked out. There was kind of a sequence of events where I got thyroid disease and it wasn't getting any better. And my cat also got thyroid disease. And I was like, I make this joke, my cat's my daughter. But, it was bizarre that it happened at the same time. And so the film is kind of about contending with this. It's like contending with the history of illness in my own life, but also in the state, because the state of Utah has this history of lying to its citizens. I don't think that it's specific to Utah, but it's just very obvious. There's a lot of research that's public about how the government tested bombs in downstate Utah and in Nevada, and how the wind blew the nuclear dust, and everybody was sick, and then the government was lying about it. And so again, like, it was a moment for me where I was like, how much are they lying to us already? And especially in a state where you can't trust what they're saying to you. And so I was trying to kind of connect this historical illness in the state with my own current kind of present day status.
When we watch the film, what are we going to see?
So the film actually starts off with a fictional narrative. There's text on screen where I wanted to try something new in my practice. And so this film is kind of an attempt at that on a few different levels. I think before this film, my practice is really personal, but I've been questioning over the last couple of years the relevance of making films in a world that is increasingly more chaotic and needs intervention. And so I think that for me, starting off this film with this like fictional narrative of these two women in bed together, and they're kind of talking about how one woman was able to evacuate Earth because she kind of had the privileges to evacuate. She had the money and the resources to, and then this other woman wasn't able to evacuate. And there's kind of this conflict that happens with them in this fictional part of the film about what it means to have the resources to evacuate a situation, whether it's like geographically or emotionally, and kind of the aftermath of that. And really, it's about, we kind of return to these two women on and off throughout the film. And for me, it was more about trying to figure out, how do you have a conversation where you cannot see the other point of view, but you remain in relationship? And to me, that is a feminist negotiation. And that's ultimately what I was interested in. It's like a moment in our country and our lives where we cannot be working through conflict often, and what does it mean to stay in conflict and move forward?
You said you wanted to try something new. Yeah. Why? Where did that impulse come from?
I think I get bored. I think I have a fear. I worked on a series of films in graduate school and beyond that were called exit strategies, and with those films, I had this fear that I think when I was done with them, that every film that I made after that could be considered an exit strategy. So there's like 6 exit strategies. And then the film that I made after that, I was like, this film needs to be different because I don't want people to watch this film and think, why is this titled something else? It could just be part of her exit strategy series. And so I think every film that I make, I want it to stand on its own. Like, I want it to have its own identity. And I think that I hold myself to a certain pressure to try to be challenging myself, to be taking risks so that it feels vulnerable. It's like a constant kind of experiment with like what feels vulnerable in that moment.
Now, obviously, you're a filmmaker, so I preface my question by saying that. You were talking about in Document with No End, talking about some really important, significant issues. Why film? Why not write a thought piece or something like that? Why does the expression have to be on film?
It's such a good question. And I feel like it's a question that I actually ask my students in the dance film class that I teach here at OSU, because most of the students in that class are dancers. And so I ask them, like, why does this need to be on film? Like, why can't it be a stage dance?
Right.
So 2 things. I think because I'm also trying to write a chapter right now for a volume on dance and disability, and it is so hard for me to get started writing this chapter. And I'm just like in this moment of like, this is why I'm a filmmaker, because it's like so much easier actually for me to get started making creative work than it is for me to be writing scholarly things. So maybe it's just like what feels exciting, is like images feel exciting and the creativity of inventing a narrative feels exciting. And I think there's also, I know that my films, when they screen in a theater, I know when they're like, quote, like working, unquote, and it's like a very ambiguous thing to say that, but I know when they're working is when the theater gets very quiet. And it almost feels like people are afraid to like accidentally drop something on the floor. And that's when I know that the film has done something. And I think that there's something in that for me about wanting or inviting people to quiet down and listen. And I think there's a lot of personal ties for that, for me. But I also think that maybe it's something I desire more in our culture and in the classroom, that we could be listening to each other more intimately.
With writing, there's not an audience to awe or to necessarily react to what you're writing. Yeah,
it's a community experience to be in a theater of people. And I've really become radicalized from somebody who hated movies, like to craving actually being in a theater.
So it would seem.
Yeah. And I have to explain that to my dance students too, because I think dancers, they understand performance. They understand the audience, like you have to have an audience. It changes the performance when you have an audience, but it's the same exact thing for film. It's when you have people in the theater watching the film, it's different than just watching it on your phone. And it's something that you have to kind of convince dancers to believe in, that the film screening is a performance.
I'd like to talk about another film, or a series of films, I guess, Room Studies.
Yeah, I started the inspiration behind those when I was in Portugal in May. And so I had a residency in Lisbon. And well, first I was late to the residency because I had gotten really sick. And then when I got there, I had a flare-up. So I have a chronic pain kind of condition, and it flares up depending on stress and a lot of other factors. And so I got there, and I've never been to Portugal before. I was so excited to be there. And I was just in so much pain, like blinding pain for the first, I would say 10 days I was there. It was this real internal struggle for me because I was like, I want to get out. I want to take walks. I want to experience, everything that's here. And at the same time, I was in bed, like having to just watch the sun move across the floor, from the window in the room. And it made me realize that how many times do I spend in rooms, like waiting for pain to pass? And actually thought of it as this is an opportunity. I feel like disability is often talked about as a creative generative force. So instead of thinking of it as, like my residency's ruined because I'm having this flare up and, all the things I could be doing if I wasn't in pain right now. Instead to, again, like reclaim this idea and think, no, actually being flared up is going to be the creative portion of this residency. Being in pain is generative to the project right now. And then I started thinking, okay, this belongs in a series. So it's, room studies, Lisbon, room studies, Columbus, room studies. It's like all the rooms that I'm in and the experience of pain in all of them.
How do you convey or represent pain and disability on film?
Such a good question. I think there's two thoughts right away. The first is through voiceover. And so even though I have a very hard time starting more kind of scholarly writing, I've always been a more creative writer. So I don't have a difficult time writing poetically or journaling or, coming up with a script. And so I think exercising voice for me through writing a voiceover is a way to actually release some pain. And it's a way to invite people into my experience. So I would say through voice or text is one method. And then another way is through the way that I'm framing the images. And so in my earlier work, I used a lot of fragmentation. So I never really showed the whole body. You never got like a wide shot of me, ever. It was always a close-up of an elbow or a close-up of a knee or a foot or an ankle. And to me, that was a metaphor for pain. And, where pain, from my experience, is that it can be really localized. And so the framing of the camera was an extension of how localized the pain felt in my body.
You've described your creative process as improvisational, or there's an improvisational nature to your creative process. Say a little more about that and about your creative process more broadly.
The way that I work in production is improvisational in the sense of I don't storyboard. I don't storyboard. I usually don't even have a shot list. I really follow my intuition, or I have an image in my head that I want to put into real life. So in that way, it's an improvisation because I have no set plan going into it other than the image or the excitement around doing something. I think I often talk about filmmaking and editing being an intuitive process for me. And as somebody who lost her intuition, that editing was actually like a muscle that I strengthened through film editing. I think I got injured because I lost my intuition in that moment. I wasn't taking care of myself. And I'm not saying this to blame myself, but I just really was pushing myself so hard and kind of forgetting who I was and wanting to please the professor I was working under at the time, wanting to please other people in the cast, wanting to kind of please, really just denying my experience of what my boundaries were for myself. And so when I came to filmmaking and started realizing that I knew exactly where to edit, I knew exactly where the cut was. It was this revolution for me in the sense of I was practicing my intuition in the editing room, but then that translated to my real life. I started realizing in my real life that I needed to be following my intuition like I was in the editing room. And so I think all this goes back to improvisation. I think improvisation is a very intuitive-based process. And so on one hand, it's very embodied because of that. And then I could also say, I experiment with different technologies, and those technologies, I'm interested in creating improvisation structures with those technologies. So kind of using older equipment, analog equipment, or in one of my films, I used a broken digital camera, and I didn't know, it was fragmenting the image, and there were colors, and it was pixelated, and there was, I never knew what it was going to look like, and that in and of itself to me was an improvisation. I kind of set up a structure and then let the broken camera be the performer.
So you don't start a film or the process with an outcome or an ending. Do you have a plot, a narrative even at that stage? Or Sometimes
I just get to a point where I'm I haven't shot in a while and I should shoot something. And then I'll be shooting in my apartment, or I'll go somewhere and shoot outside, and then I'll just dump the footage on my hard drive. And then I just am returning actually to footage I shot in 2020 that I think will make it into a project I'm working on now. And so sometimes I do have a clear idea. This past summer I broke my foot and it kind of sent me into a spiral. And I was like, I'm going to make a film about this, about being stuck in the apartment all summer. So that was probably the closest to a narrative that I've ever been at. But normally I'm kind of like montage or collage based, where I'll just collect things over time. And then eventually I'll get to a point where I'm like, I think I need to make a film soon to keep my job. No.
So as part of your research into trauma, you've coined the term memory recall. Tell us, what does this term mean?
Yeah, I think that this started when I was working on the series of exit strategies that I mentioned before, because those films were all about wondering. It was a couple years after the head injury, and I had done all the things you were supposed to do, right? Like I'd done physical therapy and acupuncture and massage and, everything you could imagine. And I was still in chronic pain. And I realized the only thing that I hadn't done was look into my childhood to actually understand, when I was injured as a child, how did I recover? Because children have an amazing resilience, they'll fall down and just get back up again. But for some reason there I was 28 years old and I had fallen down and I was not getting back up again. So I knew that it was something that I had picked up somehow, this kind of chronic pain that wasn't going away. And so I went back into my childhood, and those films were kind of all about different memories of trauma that I felt were in my body that needed to be investigated and released, and used the filmmaking as a method of that. And I think what eventually happened was that in the process of making them, I realized that I was getting triggered, when I would see them screen. So something that I was making me upset. And I had a lot of questions about that. And I was also, an experience that I had when I was teaching a class when I was in Milwaukee really stayed with me, because I showed a film. It's a film called You Take Care Now by Anne-Marie Fleming. And it's a film about a woman's rape and then a car accident that she had gotten into. And I always thought the film was really, I still really like the film. I think it's a really well done film. But I had a student come up to me afterwards who was really shook. And that experience really stayed with me, because I wondered, how do we make film about trauma without ostracizing people who are traumatized? And I think that question froze me for a long time in my practice, actually. And I think how I've come around to it is through my work with internal family systems. It's a framework, a psychology framework. And in internal family systems, you realize that it's not about ignoring the past or never retelling the past. Because I think for a long time I was like, I should just never recall memories from the past anymore because that's triggering. But I kind of realized that you actually go through a process of being aware that you're recalling memories. So it's a conscious, almost meditative process where if I'm going to make a film that has to do with a memory in the past, that I'm working with that memory consciously. I'm not letting the memory hijack me and take me over and be in the present. And so sometimes in IFS, and I'll hear myself saying this too, where I'll say, a part of me remembers when, I was 8 years old and whatever. And so just by saying a part of me separates it to say, not me in 2025, who I am now. It's a part of who I am that remembers that. So I think memory recall and my research in that is about working ethically with the past as a personal filmmaker, and how do you ethically work with trauma so that you don't re-traumatize yourself in the process.
What's next for you? What's your next risk?
So my exit strategy number 2, which I made in 2017, talks about an experience I had in physical therapy in my early 20s. And I'm actually making that into a longer piece now. So 8 years later, I've decided that I'm ready to actually go into the story more. The film right now is around 20 minutes, and then I'm teaching repertoire in the dance department this semester, and I'm working with 8 very talented undergraduate dancers, and we're going to be filming together next month. And then some of the work and the choreography that we're making in that process is going to be put into this longer film that I'm making. And I've never done that before. I've never filmed with undergrads, and I've never been so direct. Even though my position is in dance film, I've actually never made such a narrative dance film in that way. So I'm nervous about that.
What's going to be different as opposed to your other films?
I think that a lot of...
Just the length, or...?
The length, for sure, yeah. Yeah, I think all of my films are like under 10 minutes, so making something that I'm hoping to be closer to 40 or 45 is a change. But I also think working with others is... I normally work with myself, and I think working with these dancers is a challenge for me. Not in the studio, not when we're making the dance, but I think once we start the filmmaking process of it, it's going to be, yeah, I just normally work by myself.
Kym McDaniel, thank you.
Voices of Excellence is produced and recorded at the Ohio State University College of Arts and Sciences Marketing and Communications Studio. More information about the podcast and our guests can be found at go.osu.edu/voices. Voices of Excellence is produced by Doug Dangler. I'm Jen Farmer.